Brisbane in the early 1940s, a quiet, conservative city with a population that had yet to reach 350,000 people. Not a lot ever really happened in Brisbane, and World War II seemed very far away. And then in March 1941, the Americans began arriving. Brisbaneites turned out in their tens of thousands to welcome the visitors, and during the course of the war, almost 1 million US servicemen would pass through Brisbane, and the city would never be the same again.
In 1942, at the height of World War II, an incident took place here in Brisbane between US and Australian armed forces. It became known as the Battle of Brisbane, and right over there, on the intersection of Adelaide and Creek Street, is where the rioting took place. So this is it right here, ground zero for where the Battle of Brisbane occurred. And I'll go through the buildings that make up this intersection and talk a little bit about their history. Right now I'm standing outside what used to be the American Red Cross. So the American PX, the post exchange, wasn't down on the ground level. It was up here, on the 5th floor. I found something interesting about this building. The top couple of floors were only built later on. Originally this building, I think it was built about 1910, and it was one of the very first car showrooms in Brisbane. And later on, in about the 1930s, the top floor, or maybe the top 2 floors, were added, and it was on the top floor that the American PX was. So that's floor 4. So the PX is just up here. Okay, it's locked. I don't know what that is up there. Let's have a quick look. Okay, just looks like a fire exit. I'm going to head back out onto Creek Street now, see what else I can find. This area where I'm walking now, the building right behind me, what used to be there is the Gresham Hotel, and the Gresham Hotel was opposite and diagonal from the American Red Cross and also from the American PX. The Gresham Hotel was damaged in the 1974 floods and unfortunately couldn't be saved. It was demolished. So just behind me there is Student 1, and today that's a place for university students. It's accommodation for them, but back in 1942 the building that used to be there was barracks for US enlisted servicemen. And I find that really ironic that back then it was a place for accommodation for overseas visitors, and today it's a place of accommodation for overseas visitors. So here on Adelaide Street, I know that the PX is just down there, the building I was just in. It's on the corner there, that brown one there. The Australian canteen, I don't know exactly where it was. I think it was somewhere, it was either there at 313 Adelaide Street, or there at 303 Adelaide Street, the Desmond Chambers. So this here is what's known as the old Town Hall of South Brisbane. Actually it's municipal offices. And this building during World War II was the headquarters of the American military police. Prior to the Battle of Brisbane occurring, there was a lot of tension in the city between US and Australian forces. It certainly wasn't helped by the fact that the US servicemen had access to a lot more products than what their Australian counterparts did. The American PX, it's a place where servicemen and women could get items. You know, they could get things like alcohol and chocolate and ice cream as well. Things that the local digger really couldn't get at all. It was wartime, certainly rationing in Brisbane. Brisbane was essentially a garrison city and kind of cut off from the rest of Australia. The US servicemen were able to get all of these luxury items, much to the jealousy and annoyance of the local Aussie diggers. And really, truth be known, the US soldiers did look pretty amazing. They looked cool. Their uniforms were, you know, Hollywood-like, very classy. They looked terrific, whereas the poor old Aussie digger, Australian Army uniforms seemed rather ill-fitting and woolen and not all that glamorous. And that was another point of tension, certainly from the Australian soldiers to the American ones, that the local Brizzy ladies very much fancied the visiting American soldiers. And these soldiers had, as I said, access to a lot more luxury items, plus they were much better paid than the Aussie diggers. It also didn't help that a lot of the shops and restaurants and other places of business tended to favour the American soldiers over the local Aussie ones because the Americans had a lot more money. So the shopkeepers and restaurant owners could sometimes jack up the price a bit. They knew that the Americans would pay, whereas the poor old Aussie guys only had a few bob between them. But I think the main reason for the hostility between the two armies was certainly that well, let's face it was about women. The American soldiers were getting the girls and the Australians weren't. So much so that, and again, this is just what I've read, but the Australian women, the locals, would actively go out seeking American boyfriends, American service personnel, and hope to be noticed by a US soldier. It's like that old saying goes, overpaid, oversexed, and over here. There was another cause of tension during the war, and that was that the white US servicemen, some of them, not all of them of course, took exception to African American US servicemen dating white Australian women. Now for the locals, for the Australians, it wasn't a problem. They didn't mind the African American soldiers hanging out with their attractive daughters, let their daughters go out on dates with the African American soldiers. It wasn't really an issue. Generosity shown by Australian families to the African American soldiers was really quite substantial. They were very welcome. So in March 1942, troops of the US 208th Coast Artillery rioted over 10 nights against African American soldiers. The result of that riot was that all US African American soldiers had to, from then on, stay over this side of the river at South Brisbane. Sometime later, there was an African American soldier who decided that he wanted to go into the city, so he crossed Victoria Bridge. This is the new one behind me there. The Victoria Bridge at that time was the second one. There's some of the remains of it just there. And he decided to cross the river because he wanted to go into the city. The result of that decision cost him his life. He was murdered by other US servicemen. Looks like old tram lines here. There's more over that way. So what really ignited the Battle of Brisbane happened, really, it started right here on Adelaide Street, somewhere where the Australian canteen used to be. US 404th Signal Company Private James R. Stein, he left the canteen and made his way to the PX on the corner of Creek and Adelaide Street. So he started here and he walked down that way. Now apparently he was a bit worse for wear, he had a few drinks. Over there, between the PX and the Australian canteen, he was stopped by a small group of Australian soldiers, one of whom was Edward Sidney Webster of Millmerran, and he was a guy who had a bit of a short fuse and he didn't like authority all that well. And I think Webster and his friends, the Australians, were giving a bit of a hard time, but not too much. And then sometime between 6:45 and 7:15 p.m, Private Anthony E. O'Sullivan of the US 814th Military Police Company apparently he was with another MP as well, approached Stein and asked him for his leave. You had to have your papers on you. You couldn't just wander around. So the MP asked Stein, "Where's your leave pass?" And it looked like he was going to clock the fellow on the head, hit Stein on the head, and the Australians took exception to this, especially Webster, and a scuffle broke out. But anyway, the scuffle had begun. More Australian soldiers started appearing, and before you know it, you had 20, 30 people standing around. The two MPs made a break for it. They managed to get to the PX just down the road there, and Stein went with them and barricaded themselves in. Well, that was it. The spark had been lit. More Australian soldiers started showing up. Civilians. Some reports say there was upwards between 2,000 and 4,000 people eventually on the streets here. So during the confrontation, the Australians were milling about here on Creek Street, and they were smashing the windows along here of the PX building down here on ground level, and they were smashing it up with whatever they could get. It was bricks and even at one point someone picked up a street sign, and somehow they wrenched it out of the ground and used that to smash some of the glass along here. Like the focus of the riots and where Edward Webster was shot, the guy who had the rifle, I want to make sure I get this right. He was a US military policeman, Private Norbert Grant. He had the rifle. He was over at South Brisbane at the old town hall that I visited earlier. He was sent over here, and he was standing somewhere around about, well, if this is the entrance now, it may be the entrance then. The crowds were here, everyone was agitated, there was fights breaking out. He had the rifle. He came, if this was the spot, he came in here, moved to about here with the rifle, and was holding the crowds back that were just here. He was holding them back. Someone got him around the neck, and it was Edward Webster who was standing in front of him. He grabbed the front of the rifle, the weapon went off, and Webster was hit in the chest. Now, some reports say that he died at the scene, others say that he died a little bit later in hospital on the operating table. I don't know which is the correct one. Then, yeah, Grant would have been standing about here near this doorway, and this is where Webster fell. Just here. In the scuffle where Webster was shot, there were many other injuries. No one else was killed, but there was something like, I've got the figures here, it was 7 men all up were injured in the scuffle that broke out here. 6 were soldiers, and there was 1 civilian. US MP Grant, who fired the shot that struck Edward Webster, he was injured in the scuffle that took place here. Aussies trying to get at him and kill him, but other US troops managed to drag him inside into the PX building. So how did the rioting end on that first night? Well, the civilian police began to do their job and break up the crowds. More US officers and commanders, and Australian ones as well, broke up the crowd as well. Troops were ordered back to their barracks, and by 10 o'clock at night, pretty much it was all over, at least for the first day. On the next day, Friday the 27th of November 1942, the Australians turned their attention from the PX behind me to the American Red Cross, which is in front of me. That's it there. Now the building doesn't exist anymore. It says SAP out the front. I don't know what that is, but the Red Cross was right there. And outside the American Red Cross building, as the Australians were gathering out here looking for a fight, some of them apparently were armed with grenades. It wasn't just here at this intersection of Creek and Adelaide Street, it was all of the surrounding streets. Witnessed countless number of assaults, mainly from Australians against US soldiers. They were just so fed up with the way things were. You had groups of Australians standing around beating up US servicemen. There'd be a big circle of Aussie soldiers and some poor devil US GI in the middle getting the shit kicked out of him. On this section of Queen Street here, there's the GPO just over there. I don't know exactly where it was that it happened, but there was a rather large group of very well armed US soldiers. They'd formed a line across the road, and they were looking for a fight with the local Australian servicemen. And an Australian officer came up to the guy who was in charge of the Americans and persuaded them to disband. But further down the road there, outside MacArthur's headquarters, a lot of Australians started to gather and hurling abuse up towards MacArthur's office. And that's where I'm going to go and take a look now. It's not a big office, really. I thought it'd be much, much larger. It's kind of living room size, really. I just walked around behind the desk before I nearly knocked the chair over. This action camera is about to run out of power, and I've got to go through my bag and get a battery. The only desk available is MacArthur's. I don't really think I can put my bag on his desk. By the time of the second night of the riot, people's anger and aggression and frustration seem to have died down. Maybe it's a case of just the soldiers needed to vent their anger and their jealousies against the Americans. And it's right, I think, that the Australians did feel left out. They almost felt like they were excluded from their own city, and that's not a good feeling, especially in wartime. After that, everyone pretty much just got on with the job of defeating the Japanese and trying to bring an end to World War II. By the third day, the 28th of November, things had become a lot calmer. The Australian command determined that it was Australian troops who were responsible for the riots. Some Australian troops were moved out of the city bounds, more military police were put on the streets, and things pretty much fizzled out. US military MP Grant was found not guilty of the murder of Webster. By and large, for the rest of the war, Australian and US troops got on well. But that's not quite the end of the story, because there's one other place I want to take a look at, and it's at Toowong. This here is the final resting place of Gunner Edward Sidney Webster, died 26th of November 1942 during the Battle of Brisbane. He was the only fatality during that confrontation.